This is a conversation with Jeremy Schapiro, a research director at the European Council on Foreign Relations and a former policy planner and special advisor at the US State Department. And this conversation is about a single extremely important question. What will Donald Trump's foreign policy in the next 4 years look like? And how is it going to change the world as we know it? We talked about how are Donald Trump's foreign policies actually created, and what are the different ideological camps that shape them, and about what his policies will actually look like on Europe and NATO, Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Iran, and China and Taiwan. My personal goal going into this was to try to be as pragmatic and unbiased as possible, to try to analyze what Donald Trump's foreign policy might actually look like, rather than to judge him as a person, because there's not enough of the first and probably too much of the latter. Whether that was successful or not is up to you. The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And this podcast is also supported by generous supporters on Patreon that you can join to get full-length ad-free episodes and a bunch of other perks. And now, enjoy the conversation. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk about a lot of very specific topics and a lot of specific foreign policy decisions that the Trump administration might take. But before we get to that, to the specifics, I wanted to go in a little bit more depth and talk about how that policy, that foreign policy, is likely, on those specific topics, is likely being shaped. Because that is often very unclear. It's often kind of confusing where all the different policy decisions coming from. And you came up with this really interesting framework of how Trump's foreign policy is shaped, and that it is shaped by sort of three ideological tribes that are competing with each other. So could we start there and talk a little bit about that? How do these different individual takes that Trump and people around him come up with, how is that actually created?
Right. Well, let me back up a little bit. I think that we did a project for the last couple of years of trying to understand emerging Republican foreign policy thought, particularly for people who, among the people who were sort of Trumpians, people who supported the president, not the traditional Republicans who had become never-Trumpers. And we found these three camps that you're talking about. There's three different ideological approaches to foreign policy. The first one was the primicists, who are people who deeply believe in the American role in the world, in the American leadership in the world. This is more or less an old line, traditional approach. The second were the prioritizers. These were people who believed that the challenge from China meant that we had to retrench in places like Europe and the Middle East and focus American foreign policy very strictly on the problems in China and in East Asia. And then the third camp were what we called the restrainers, people who believed that America had sufficient problems at home, should be focused more fundamentally on those problems, and should not be going out trying to establish leadership in any areas of the world. Obviously, these are approximations. There are many people who don't define themselves in each of these camps. I think that the difficulty is not so much with those camps, because I think people do recognize that. And we actually had quite a bit of uptake from amongst the Republicans themselves, who found this to be a useful division. But translating those divisions into policy is quite hard in a Trump administration, because what sits at the center of it is Donald Trump himself. It's a little bit difficult to say which camp he is in. Broadly, I would assign him to the restrainers, but I think there are many, many exceptions to that. And I think maybe more importantly, he is not really ideologically in any of these camps, because he's somebody who has ideology on foreign policy, with the possible exception of trade and maybe immigration. But more generally, he is deeply flexible and more interested in his domestic political standing and his personal financial interests than any foreign policy ideology or approach to the world. And similarly, in his picks, he's not picking people to the key positions in government based on these ideologies. I think people are often trying to say, well, he just picked a restrainer, so that means he wants to be more restrained. And then they're having trouble understanding the mix of people in his administration. I think actually the explanation is kind of simple. He's not picking on this basis. He's picking on the base. He's not picking a team that will implement a certain foreign policy ideology or doctrine. He's picking people who are, in the first instance, incredibly loyal to him. That's definitely the primary consideration, quite a contrast from the last time he was president. And secondarily, he's picking people who he feels good about, who look good in suits, who look good on television, who annoy Democrats and liberals. I feel quite confident that when they take this sort of first cabinet picture, I guess that'll probably be tomorrow, of this cabinet, it will be the cabinet with the best jawline in American history. These are very, very attractive people, and that's actually a more important criteria than for Donald Trump than how they feel about the South China Sea or the war in Ukraine.
So I guess we can't say that one of those tribes has won because it's sort of an ongoing competition over the mind of Donald Trump. But can we say whether one of them is winning at the moment, or is one of these camps dominating?
Well, dominating would be too strong, but I think we can make some statements in that regard. And to me, it's a little bit less about which positions they've gotten than the sort of inherent strength they have for their position in other areas and in given the geopolitical situation. Currently, the prioritizers are, well, I should back up a little bit. Before the election, I would say that the primicists sort of dominated the Congress, and they dominated the Republican foreign policy elite. The restrainers really had a very strong support within the Republican base and with the voters, who seemed to be much more interested in restrainer policies. The prioritizers actually had neither of those advantages, but they represent a little bit of a compromise between the two. And because the prioritizers and the primicists feel like they have traditionally been excluded from Republican foreign policy making, they have sort of united against the primicists. And they if you think about it, they come together on the two major theaters, on two of the three major theaters, I should say, on Europe, particularly on Ukraine, they have the same policy prescription on that. And on the Middle East, they have a similar policy prescription, both of which is sort of, let's reduce American commitments and turn over responsibility to regional actors. On China, they have a very fundamental difference, but they've sort of agreed to put that aside while they deal with the other things. There's a sort of first rule of Washington politics is, if you can agree on step one, don't fight over step two. And so they have agreed on step one. And so I think that the prioritizers, particularly with their sort of compromise position, with their ability to appeal to the primacist desire to take on China, and with their ability to, sort of buy off the restrainers by reducing commitments in Europe and the Middle East, have a very strong hand to play. And you've seen that in the positions that they've got, particularly at the DoD, which I think will be quite, the Department of Defense, which I think is always quite influential in internal bureaucratic battles because it's just so large and has so many weapons. I think you'll see they've really, with Pete Hegseth and with Ridge Colby, I think they could really dominate that, and I think that will be very influential. But having said all that, there's a lot of other all three camps have various strengths, and there's a strange domestic interaction with some of these issues. On China, the strong links that have emerged almost since the election between Trump and people who have a very strong interest in keeping up the economic relationship with China, people like Elon Musk and Scott Bessent, his Treasury Secretary, mean that maybe we won't see as strong a policy toward China as most people have been expecting. And similarly, on the Middle East, Israel is such an important domestic issue within Trump's coalition that it is very hard. And while that doesn't, and everything in the Middle East is connected to everything else, and ultimately to Israel. So, starting with an Israel interest, he may end up having some difficulty implementing a more restrained or prioritized policy in the Middle East. But we'll see.
Well, one more thing that I wanted to note on this sort of high-level discussion of the origin of Trump policy, I think sometimes, especially in Europe, it tends to be seen, Trump and people around him and this sort of new wave in the Republican Party, they tend to be portrayed as isolationists, and only the restrainers tend to be seen, or they seem to be the most visible ones. But that is actually, from what you're saying, that is incorrect and really too simplified.
Yeah, absolutely. Too simplified along two lines. First, in the way that we already covered it, there is a balance. It's not an exact balance, but all of these factions have important assets and are represented in the U.S. government that Trump is bringing in and the new administration is bringing in. Secondly, and I think maybe most importantly, the restrainers are not isolationists. This is a calumny, frankly, and it's a way of trying to write them out of the script of U.S. foreign policy. It's a way of it's a pejorative description which is meant to caricature their position. They are, I would say, against American leadership in the world. There are roughly 180 countries in the world that have a non-isolationist foreign policy that aren't aspiring to leadership of the entire world. And restrainers are generally speaking very focused on America's role in the world. And America is the biggest economy in the world. It's deeply intertwined in the world by its culture, by its economy, by its history, by its very nature. There is no possibility of it being isolationist. And the idea that just because you have less than 100,000 troops in Europe, you are isolationist is quite absurd.
So, out of the many things, if we're going to move on to the specific topics, out of the many things that I wanted to talk about, there was one topic that I really didn't expect, but that we sort of need to start with because Trump recently put it on the table. And
is that Greenland? Is it Greenland?
It is Greenland, yeah.
Lucky guess, yeah.
And not just Greenland, also Canada and Panama, all that. And basically the talk about, not sure how to call it, using force to somehow take those territories or annex it. And I think it's been extremely confusing. And no one really seems, whether in the US or especially outside of it, no one really seems to know how to take it and how seriously we should be taking it, or where is all of that even coming from? So what's your take?
Yeah, sure. I mean, on a certain level, I don't know either. I have some opinions. I would say the problem with Trump as president is he says things which shouldn't be taken seriously, but because he's president of the United States, you absolutely have to take them seriously. When the president says something, ipso facto, it has meaning and import and effect. And so no matter how ridiculous it is, or no matter what reason he has for saying it, you just have to take it seriously. There's no choice because other people will. I think the whole series of statements about Greenland and the Panama Canal and the 51st state of Canada fall into those categories. I don't think they are very serious, at least, conceivably he actually wants to buy Greenland, but I don't think he's going to attack Denmark to do it. By and large, Trump makes a tremendous number of forceful threats, executes very little of them, but largely he is a chicken hawk. He's quite afraid of war. And quite proud of the fact that he hasn't really committed the United States to many to wars, and he frequently mentioned, incorrectly, of course, that he was the only president not to do this in 100 years or something. In fact, Jimmy Carter didn't do it, and actually, kind of Joe Biden did. But let's put that aside for a minute. He brags about this. So I think there's actually no chance that he's going to do any of those things. So why would he mention them? Well, at a fundamental level, I don't really know. And Donald Trump, it could be just because he had a bad cheeseburger that day. But if you want to try to come up with a reasonable explanation, a logical explanation, I think that that what he's trying to do is something that he does quite often, which is acquire leverage in negotiations. He wants to get some things out of Greenland and out of Panama and out of Canada. And so he makes ridiculous threats. He's the president of the United States. They have to take them seriously. And so it's the sort of usual thing about taking hostages in a negotiation. You kidnap someone's child and then you agree to let them go for something that you wanted in the first place. And they somehow think they succeeded in the negotiation. So you can imagine Denmark supporting Trump's trade initiatives with Europe in exchange for him shutting up about Greenland. And so he, in some sense, he wins that for nothing, or getting some concession on keeping the Chinese out of Greenland or something like that. You can see there's a lot of financial interests that the U.S. has in the Panama Canal too. Trump is about to probably embark on some sort of trade negotiation with Canada. So this idea of taking these hostages is pretty good. I think that can work. It worked frequently in his first term, not always, but frequently, and it's a pattern for him. I don't think, I'd love to say to people, don't take this stuff seriously, but again, sort of because he's not really intending to do any of it, but I don't think we can say that to people. They have to take it seriously.
Well, that was sort of my hypothetical question that would follow up. If you were hypothetically an advisor to Prime Minister of Denmark or an EU foreign affairs official, and they were asking you how should they approach this, what would your advice be? Because my advice would be to sort of ignore it.
My advice would be to ignore it, but then the prime minister would come back to me and say, what kind of an idiot are you? How can I accept a threat from the president of the United States to take over Greenland by force and not say anything? Like, the press will kill me in Denmark. The population of Denmark will be wanting to know what I'm going to do about this. So yeah, my instinct is yours. Ignore it. That would be the best thing to do. But it's also not really a viable option for these people. And I'm sympathetic to that. I think, they've tried to come out and sort of be strong, but not pay too much attention. But I think at the end of the day, what's gone on is that a country like Denmark, a deeply, deeply loyal ally of the United States for decades, a country that has really absorbed the sort of core concept of the transatlantic alliance, which is that it's not about transactions, right? It's about the fact that we have each other's back, that we support each other, and therefore, if you ask us to do something, we do it, and we assume we'll get paid back. For a country like that, to hear this from the president of the United States is deeply disturbing, but it also demonstrates that all of their attachment to the United States over the decades has created an enormous dependency and vulnerability that they never expected an American president to exploit. And now one is. The structure of the situation between the U.S. and Europe is that Europe is incredibly dependent. The U.S. has, by and large, over the decades, not taken advantage of that. But Trump seems to want to. And so at this point, there's not, given the structure of the dependence that Europe has entered into with the United States, there's not terribly much in the short term that a country like Denmark can do about it. So my guess is they're going to seek to appease Trump. They're going to say, well, okay, I can see you want Greenland. We can't do that. This is a constitutional issue. How about we give you, I don't know, a lot of money, some basing rights, maybe a parade through Copenhagen, I don't know, whatever. And they'll hope that he gets appeased by that. They don't have that many other choices because they don't have because of the structural situation and because they don't think that their European allies will really support them.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. It's launching from January, it's completely free, and you can already sign up so that you receive the first edition. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. Apart from Europe and NATO, if there's one country that I imagine is probably right now pretty worried about Trump's new presidency and the consequences of that, it wouldn't actually be Russia or China, but probably it would be Iran. Because Trump has some pretty big Iran hawks in his team, and they have talked about a new policy of maximum pressure on Iran, which is maybe one of the few concrete policies that they've repeatedly talked about. So what do you expect that Trump's policy towards Iran as one of the main U.S. adversaries will look like?
Yeah, it's a policy in which I'm quite confused. So I don't have a good answer for you. I mean, obviously, we have in the first term that the primicists in my categorization clearly won out on Iran policy, and they're reasonably positioned to do that again, in part because Israel is such an important exception in Trump's foreign policy. It's really a domestic issue in the United States, and the instinct that Trump has to support Israel is very strong, and that comes from the domestic configuration he finds himself in, not from a foreign policy view. And obviously for Israel, Iran is the number one priority, and so a very hawkish position toward Iran sort of emanates out from your Israel approach. There are some counterindications, though, this time. One is that there really seems to be a potential for a deal, which could entice Trump. You know, the weird thing about his approach to Iran in his first term is that he ran being very against the Iran deal and the Iran nuclear deal that Obama had negotiated, and he once in office withdrew the United States from that deal. Took him a little over a year, but he did it. But right after he did so, he sort of expressed a desire to be back in one. And it became quite clear over time that the thing that he really hated about the deal was that Obama had negotiated it, nothing really about the content, which is typical for him. And now that the Iranians are on the back foot, to put it mildly, because of the Israeli military successes, particularly in Lebanon, it seems as if the Iranians might be a little bit more willing to enter into a similar kind of deal on potentially somewhat better terms from the perspective of the United States than they did in 2015. And that has got to be very enticing to Trump. He loves that kind of thing, and being able to deliver that would be something that he's often said he wants to do. That would put him at odds with some key members of his administration, for sure, and with a lot of key interests in the Republican Party. As I've said before, he could take those things on. He could definitely do it against those people. I'm not sure in that case whether he will, and I think that the most difficult wild card in this is the Israelis themselves. They have such ability to work the U.S. domestic politics on this issue, and where Trump himself have a lot of different inroads to him. And if they are not on board with what he would want to do in Iran, they might have the capacity to just scuttle it. So that's a very long way of saying, I don't know. Could go either way.
Well, one thing that I also find really interesting, but I haven't really heard being discussed too much, is that basically the FBI came up with or claimed that they have an evidence that Iran was planning to assassinate Trump when he was a candidate, the IRCG. And well, I would imagine that doesn't buy you a lot of goodwill from anyone, but especially from Trump.
Yeah, well, that's certainly how I would feel about it. By the way, I think that that has been well noted, and it's probably true. But I'm not sure that I agree with your point about goodwill. Well, I guess I agree. It doesn't buy you a lot of goodwill, but goodwill is irrelevant. And I think that this is where we keep coming back to this with Trump, and you, because you're a human being, find it very difficult to integrate into your worldview. That he's not really moved by these sort of feelings of morality or values, or even, that he doesn't really care that people hate him. I think if it were me and someone was trying to assassinate me, that would, affect my opinion of them and affect my willingness to do a deal with them. I don't think that happens with Trump. If he can get what he wants out of them, I think he won't really pay much attention to that. It is notable that he hasn't really, that this whole point that the FBI, when the FBI revealed that he was a target for them, he hasn't really changed in any significant way, or he's barely referred to it. Doesn't seem to have affected his Iran policy, and he's been making some mixed signals on Iran. I mean, he's definitely at times quite hawkish and quite anti-Iranian, but other times he's like, well, when we could do a deal with them. So I don't know. I definitely don't know what he's going to do or what his administration is going to do. I guess if I had to bet, I don't think they're going to go for an Iran deal, but I don't think they'll succeed at getting an Iran deal. But I could be wrong. But I do feel somewhat more certain that that's not a big factor.
You've mentioned that Israel, and in that it seems really different from Europe, does seem to have a lot more ways of how to convince Trump to do or not do certain things. Why is that?
I don't think I said convince Trump. Again, that's not what we're doing here. I hate to be nitpicky, but I think what the Israelis have is a real capacity to affect U.S. domestic politics, and that is something that certainly matters to Trump. They also have this sort of very strong image. They seem to be winners, and that's attractive to him. So I think they just have put themselves in the type of strong negotiating position with Trump by virtue of their ability to affect U.S. domestic politics, by virtue of the strength they've shown on their own, by virtue of the victories they've had, even though they're quite dependent on the United States, maybe as or more dependent than the Europeans. They have demonstrated a much greater capacity to be independent, to go their own way, and to make trouble for the U.S. president. There's this famous quote from Bill Clinton when back in the late 90s when he couldn't get Netanyahu to do what he wanted to do, and he said, who the fuck is the superpower here? So now, 25 years later, Bill Clinton is retired and a vegan, and the guy who drove him to those curses is still the prime minister of Israel. It's an astonishing fact. And this guy is now moving to his sixth U.S. president to annoy. And he's driven a lot of them to vulgarity, and he's extremely good at it. And I think Trump is a distinct challenge for him, obviously, as it is for every other leader. But I think the Israelis are quite well placed to do this.
Do you think that Trump or his administration will have some sort of a specific goal for, or a specific Israel policy, or is it just more reactive to see what happens?
No, they definitely have an Israel policy. And that's another source of leverage, I think, for the Israelis. It's quite important to Trump to follow up on the Abraham Accords and to bring Saudi Arabia into that, and then to declare through that agreement that they have solved the Israeli-Palestinian problem. That is the holy grail of American diplomacy. Every U.S. president since Jimmy Carter has taken a shot at that. I think the Trump people believe that they accomplished quite a bit with the Abraham Accords. They believe that they can extend it. This is actually, by the way, what the Biden people were trying to do too, and weren't that far away. It seems like they were. People think they were a lot further, but actually, the Saudis are still quite interested in this. And the horrors of the Gaza war have changed their rhetoric on it a little bit, but not actually their policy. U.S. officials were frequently telling me that it was the Israelis that were in the impediment, not the Saudis. Now that the Gaza war has entered at least a more quiescent phase, I think it will definitely be something that the Trump administration will be pushing forward. That's something that accords with pretty much all of the camps in the Trump orbit. And Trump himself. So I think that's something they're very likely to try to do. And I think it's something that they might even have some success in. The question is, how do they wrap Iran into that? And that is, it's maybe the next step, but it is important. The primicists will see an Abraham Accord as a way of sort of strengthening an anti-Iranian coalition. The restrainers will see it as a prelude to a deal with Iran that will allow them to reduce the U.S. presence and effort in the Middle East. And either of those is possible as a next step. But, like I said, if you can agree on step one, don't argue over step two.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. So, let's move to China, which is obviously the biggest geopolitical challenge for the United States and the main U.S. adversary. And it seems that unlike almost all the other topics, China does seem to be the one challenge or a topic that basically on which people from both sides of the spectrum, Democrats and Republicans, tend to agree on sort of broadly. So what do you expect Trump's China policy to look like? And is it actually going to be any different in some significant ways than the policy that Biden's administration had?
Yeah, I think it will. It's true, as you said, that there is a fairly broad bipartisan consensus on China, which is unusual these days. And that unites the Democratic and Republican foreign policy establishments. I don't think that Trump is precisely part of that. And I think that that's maybe something that people haven't figured out. He has a very particular approach to China, as far as I can tell, which is consistent with what we've been talking about before. He's not very interested in the geopolitics of China. He's not interested in Taiwan Strait issues or who controls the South China Sea. He's very interested in the economic issues with China. He's very interested in the question of trade deficits and the question of sort of the technological race, who's going to seize the economic heights of the future. And it's hard to understand how these things come together. Not many people separate the two of them. The Biden administration was quite interesting in this regard, in that they were also quite hawkish on China. They were part of that consensus. They introduced what I would call a sort of full spectrum challenge to China that the Trump administration hadn't quite done, in the sense that they were building up much more on the military side, but they were also engaged in a sort of technological containment of China and an emulation of China's strategic industrial policy, which was completely new. Trump administration had never really engaged on that topic. It's not really clear how Trump himself or the new Trump administration feels about that as a whole. about the technological containment. Trump himself seems more interested in trade issues, so he'd be willing to sort of sell away either the Taiwan Strait or the technological containment of China for a big soybean deal or $500 billion in purchases and U.S. energy or something like that, which has nothing to do with geopolitical competition, just has to do with trade deficits. So obviously, most of the people within his administration, even the restrainers, don't really take that approach to China. So I'm finding it increasingly difficult to predict how his administration is going to lean on China. The China hawks seem very strong in the DoD. I think they're going to be pushing very hard for military buildups. But on the economic side, I think that what we've seen, much to my surprise, is the appointment of a lot of people who are in favor of the economic relationship with China, or are against the technological containment, against the industrial policy aspects that the Biden administration brought in. And I think they might be pushing for an approach that looks more like the Trump administration's first term policy, where they sort of satisfy the president by taking steps that reduce the U.S. trade deficit with China, but otherwise actually strengthen and deepen the economic relationship with China, even as they are building up military forces in the South China Sea or something like that. Whether all of that comes together, there's so many contradictions in what I just said. I'm not really sure. So I think I fear I'd probably confused this issue more than enlightened it, but I think it's, in some sense, I think it's one of the most difficult ones, and I think people have generally assumed based on the kind of statement that you made, which I do agree with, that because there is a fair amount of consensus on this stuff within the foreign policy community, both Democratic and Republican, that the policy is more or less set, and it will be more or less a continuation or expansion of the Biden administration policy. I'm not sure that that's true. Could be, but I'm actually would be inclined to bet against it.
I think it's interesting that you sort of present Trump's view as separating the geopolitics and the trade and the economics. But I would say that probably in this particular case, those two are very much aligned, and the geopolitics of keeping Taiwan independent is not just because of values, but also because in many ways it's beneficial in some pretty key areas like the chip making for the United States. So there is a clear rational benefit. Do you think that Trump sees this, or?
So why is the chip making in Taiwan beneficial for the United States? Is that beneficial for Taiwan?
No, but it's better for the United States if the chips are made by a democratic independent nation than if it was controlled by China.
Maybe. I'm not sure that Trump feels that way. Right. We've seen no evidence of that. He's never really, clearly the Biden administration felt that way. But I think that Trump thinks that the chips should be made in the United States and that would be good for the United States. You retreated into this idea that because Taiwan was an ally, because Taiwan was a democracy, that was better for the United States that they produced the chips. I have those views too, so I'm not trying to mock you for asserting them, but I don't see much evidence that Trump holds those views. He doesn't seem to care whether countries are democracies along any dimension. Actually seems to kind of not like it, if anything. And he's not, as we've pointed out, he's not really very into alliances. He thinks that the Taiwanese particularly have been, like the Germans or the Japanese, have been benefiting from our protection, not paying enough for it themselves, and using the benefits to steal a march on us economically. So I'm not really sure he's that interested in protecting the Taiwanese chip capacity. Taiwan is obviously an important point of leverage with the Chinese. But the key question is, what is Trump trying to achieve with the Chinese? In the Biden case, in the case of the broader foreign policy establishment, we understand that for them it's about a broad geopolitical competition about the Cold War, like the Cold War. And so what they wanted was dominance, and so they were willing to fight on every issue. It occurs to me, and I'm not certain of it, that Trump actually isn't really interested in a lot of those things. What he wants is to seize back manufacturing from the Chinese and others. And what he wants is to eliminate trade deficits with the Chinese and with others. And if he can accomplish those things while selling out the Taiwanese or whoever, that would be fine. It's not clear. I would have to admit that this is not something that was obvious in the first term. The stars are so aligned against Trump in pushing this policy, given the views in Congress and the Democratic Party and everywhere else, pretty much, that maybe he won't be able to do it. But I'm quite struck by some of the appointments on this, which had been a surprise to me. Elon Musk, particularly, but also the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and the Commerce Secretary. All of these people are real strong advocates of, yes, a better economic deal with China, but not a geopolitical competition in the nature of the Cold War with China. And I think that that's quite a distinct approach.
I think it's really interesting how this conversation sort of highlights, and I consider myself being pretty pragmatic and having quite pragmatic views on this sort of U.S. foreign policy, but based on how frequently you point out my misunderstandings of it, it kind of highlights how unprepared and how difficult it's going to be for leaders everywhere to sort of get used to the U.S. under Trump.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, I could be wrong about a lot of this stuff, but I think that what we're trapped in is that we have a U.S. foreign policy establishment and a U.S. foreign policy record, which even through the first Trump term is fairly consistent on these types of issues. There were some important exceptions all the way through, and especially in the Trump term, but there was no Trump revolution in foreign policy in the first term. And so it is, looking back on that basically 80-year record, getting in a new mindset is quite difficult. And there's two elements to it. One is, does Trump really believe this? And second, does he have the power to push it through against the entrenched institutional opposition that exists even within his own party? And certainly in the first term, we never found out the answer to the first question, because we found out that the answer to the second question was he could not. I think the institutional constraints are much less in the second term, although they still exist to a certain degree. And maybe now we'll finally understand what he actually wants to do on these things. And I think we should, at the very least, expand our mind to the possibilities. I think the worst thing you can do in trying to understand the second Trump administration is to say, well, it's always been this way. America has always done it this way, or they did it this way in the first Trump administration, so that's the way it must be. I think we have to consider that he is quite radical, not exactly in his policy, but in his approach. That he isn't interested in geopolitics, that he's primarily interested to a much greater degree in his domestic political standing and his personal financial interests, which we haven't talked about, but I think are quite important, although hard to chart. And that he's very, and he's not interested in values, he's not interested in alliances, and he's not interested in history. And all of that is the very opposite of Joe Biden or almost any other American president since World War II. So I think that at least allows for the possibility of some quite surprising outcomes. So I guess we'll have to see.
Well, one outcome that might be really important is related to the fact that Trump will likely be a president at a time that's considered to be of very high risk for a possible US-China confrontation, since Chinese military is supposedly targeted or ordered to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. And obviously, it's not clear whether that's going to happen or not. But shortly put, there is a non-zero chance that within the next 4 years, there might be some kind of a military conflict or attempt from China to take Taiwan by force. And Biden was very obvious about what he would do in such case. But with Trump, that's much more difficult, both because of what you said and because of the remarks that he had on this. So if, the push would come to shove and there would be a real Taiwan crisis and Trump had to make a decision, how do you think he would approach it, and what do you think he would do?
Yeah. So I'm going to make the mistake of actually answering this question.
On the record.
Yeah, on the record, because I don't think he will defend Taiwan under almost any circumstances. You should never completely rule it out. Of course, it depends a little bit on the context, what's going on in U.S.-China relations, what the nature of the crisis is. So I won't completely rule it out, but I think in most of the imaginable crises, if the Chinese are even a tiny bit adroit in their diplomacy and in their fashioning of the narrative of the crisis, I think it should be very easy for them to get Trump to abandon the Taiwanese. And so that's the outcome that I would expect. I think the Taiwanese should be aware of that. One
of the biggest challenges and topics on Trump's table is going to be obviously Russia and Ukraine. And Trump has been saying for by now maybe a year that he has a plan and that he will end the war in 24 hours from taking office, which is today. So does he, in your view, actually have a plan? And if he does, what does this plan look like? Thank you for listening to the first part of this episode. If you want to help me make more of these interviews, which take surprising amount of time and effort, and get access to the second part, you can become a supporter on Patreon. There's over 30 minutes of this conversation left in the second part, but whether you decide to become a supporter or not, thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time.